this evening. This is a wonderful crowd, a great turnout. I'm so happy to see all of you here today. I see many returning faces, some new faces as well. For those of you who do not know who I am, my name is Alexandra Elliott. I'm the Executive Director of Quincy Historical Society. And so welcome for those of you who have never been here before. This is Quincy Historical Society in the beautiful Allington County building. So tonight we are here for the program State of Rebellion Part 2, which may be some of you asking, when was Part 1? And that was back in April. It was actually a talk that was hosted over at the Thomas Green Public Library, where Ed Fitzgerald and Ron Damon both spoke about the various lead-ups, some local, some a little bit more regional, regarding the lead-up to the shot for ground of Rome and Battle of Conquest and Conquered. And tonight, we are here for Part 2 of that epic story. That being, of course, the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill, for which we are here on the actual anniversary of that battle itself. So we're very fortunate that we were able to have it here tonight as well.
Thank you so much.
So that is what we commemorate here today. Just for a little bit of historical context, the battle began at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and by 5 p.m. it had wrapped up. So by the time that we are standing here right now, the battle was already over. It was known for being one of the heaviest casualty count for the British during the entirety of the American Revolution. Roughly 1,000 British soldiers were either killed, wounded, or missing in action, versus 450 American or militiamen during the same battle. So it was considered to be a very historic victory coming out of that battle. But I am not here to give you a presentation here tonight. I am here to really introduce our wonderful panel of speakers that we have lined up that will be hearing from. And those include the City of Quincy's Director of Historic and Heritage Resources, I hope I said that right, Bob Damon, our Executive Director Emeritus Ed Fitzgerald from Quincy Historical Society, and Professor Karima Lewis from Emerson College. So why don't we all give a very, very warm Quincy.
All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being out here on this slightly rainy Bunker Hill anniversary. I'm kicking us off tonight with a little bit about what this program is going to be about and a little bit about what it's not. We are here in the Braintree Historical Society. The Quincy Historical Society. I'm already back 250 years ago. We are in the North Precinct of Old Braintree. And tonight, we're going to be spending a little bit of time trying to use the clicker. Here we go. Our journey this evening. So our journey tonight is actually on the anniversary, but it's going to be about Braintree. And it's going to have... Nope, I can't do it from over there.
Oh dear.
It is going to stretch actually back to April 19th. Because if those of you who were at Part 1 know, we stopped with General Gage perseverating in Boston about what he was going to do with everything happening. So we're going to go back to April 19th. But we're going to be here in Braintree when we do. We're going to focus on the voices of people who are living in Braintree at that time. Those include Abigail and John Adams, not surprisingly. It also includes a certain guy named Joseph Palmer, happened to be a resident of Germantown. I will also be mentioning another individual. His name is Aaron Hayward. If you've seen the latest Quincy Historical Society newsletter, then perhaps you know a little bit about Mr. Hayward and his diary. Am I speaking out of turn, Ed?
Nope, not at all.
Okay, good. Thanks to one of the fearless local historians who is in this room at the moment. Perhaps we'll give him a little more credit when we get there. We're also going to be talking about the realities of the fact that it's now life in wartime. Braintree is just south of Boston. British ships of many different sizes can be here in less than an hour. And there's a lot of change that happens within the community itself as a result of what has been brewing. So we're going to be talking about that. And one more thing. There's more that we don't actually know about related to all of this than what we actually do. So one of the exciting things for history nerds like myself is that there's a lot more stuff to discover. And what we're going to do tonight is try to give you a good sense, at least, or a general sense of the things that we do really know about. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Ed to get us started.
All right. Hi. So, good evening. It is good to see a fine turnout like this on a less than fine night. As Bob sort of indicates, because of how we're going at this, we're not going to go in strictly chronological order. We're going to be doing it kind of in a topical chronological mix. And we're going to start with Abigail and John and their letters to one another during this time period, which is really the beginning. This is really the first part of the really great series of correspondence between the two of them when he is away for significant periods of time and really significant stuff is happening. Obviously, some of this has gone on before, but this is really where it starts. And we start with a letter that I think is now quite famous to everyone, Abigail's letter about the Battle of Bunker Hill. The day, perhaps the decisive day, is come when the fate of America is decided, how about I read it from here because I can't see all the way around the corner. The decisive day has come, and how about I find my glasses while I'm doing it? And how about I get them disengaged? Exactly. There we go. All right, now we're going. The decisive day is come on which the fate of America depends. My bursting heart must find vent at my pen. And the letter goes on like that. It is passionate, it is serious, it is full of eloquence. And at the same time, we have this curious situation. They are separated. John has left for the Second Continental Congress at the end of April. By May 2nd, he is already in Hartford, and May 10th, he has reached Philadelphia, and the Congress is convened. And of course, there is a problem of time, of space, of distance, and of transportation. So as she is writing this, John is writing like this. This letter, I presume, will go to the brave and amiable, go by the brave and amiable General Washington. Our Army will have a group of officers equal to any service. Washington, Ward, Lee, etc. The Congress are all as deep as the delegates from the Massachusetts, and the whole continent as forward as Boston. We shall have a redress of grievances or an assumption of the powers of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, throughout the whole continent very soon. So there's a kind of disjunction that is in no sense intentional, but is very real. They are talking past one another, and they wind up doing this, particularly at this particular juncture, quite frequently. Abigail is 30. She's only 30. She's got 4 kids, right? And of whom the oldest is Nabby, who is 9. She's sitting literally under the gun. And she's in proximity to danger, to violence, to disruption. She expresses this in her letters by expressing her emotions and also by relating facts. John, on the other hand, is down in Philadelphia. He's involved in politics. He is limited in what he can actually say to her of substance because they're working under seal. He very often does express his concern. For instance, they both learn about the death of Josiah Quincy Jr. Just as he is leaving for the trip. He often expresses concern about what is undergoing the people of Boston. But it tends to be curt, and there tends to be this interest in how much they are accomplishing there. What will they do? How far will they go? And he is sometimes, insensitive might be too strong a word, but he kind of is a little tone deaf when she is expressing her distress. He will give her all sorts of advice. At one point, relatively early on, he says to her, Well, if something really goes wrong, take the kids and fly to the woods, which nobody quite understands what he's thinking about when he says that. And even when he's more general and more thoughtful about it, he is curt, I think is the right word. Part of this, I think, is that he remembers vividly the powder alarm of September the previous year, when at the First Continental Congress, a way out of control rumor story about incredible violence in Boston had everybody running around with their hair on fire, and turned out, of course, to be not true at all. So he keeps warning her, don't listen to everything, don't respond to every story you hear, kind of keep yourself under control. When she does actually, excuse me, when she does actually have a real story that we're going to talk about, something really big that does happen, he says, I'm afraid you will have more alarms, but I hope you will maintain your philosophical composure. As time goes on in this conversation, naturally, things begin to calm down. There's a lot of nervousness right in the wake of Lexington and Concord. And then, as Abigail herself says in her letters to him, things are a little bit back to normal. Things are not really back to normal. The schools are still closed, but they start dealing with more kind of day-to-day stuff, like his brother, John's brother, Elihu, wants a commission of the Army, and they start talking about how they're going to get that done. She talks to her friend, writes to her friends Mercy Otis Warren and Eunice Payne, who's the sister of Robert Tree Payne, and they start talking in more ordinary ways about potential visits and things like that. But then, by mid-June, for reasons we'll also see as we go along, there's a sense that something is brewing, and the tension begins to rise again, and that's when we start getting into this. On the 16th, so one day before the actual battle, she writes to John, necessity will oblige General Gage to take some desperate steps. We live in a continual expectation of alarms. We expect our seacoasts ravaged. Perhaps the very next letter I write will inform you that I have been driven away from our quiet cottage. And that is, she is going out on the 16th. On the 17th, going in the other direction, is John triumphantly declaring, I can now inform you that the Congress has made the choice of the modest and virtuous, amiable, generous, and brave George Washington, Esquire, to be the General of the American Army, and he is to repair as soon as possible to the camp before Boston. In the letter that we have on the screen, the one that from her reaction to the battle itself, she does a couple of things that are sort of characteristic. She expresses real fear. Charlestown, she says to him, is laid in ashes. 'Tis expected they'll come out over Boston Neck tonight. A dreadful battle must ensue. The constant roar of cannon is so distressing that we cannot eat, drink, or sleep. And as she always does repeatedly in these letters, she tries to find solace and a kind of resolution in quoting scripture. So she says, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, but the God of Israel is he that giveth strength and power unto his people. But it isn't sufficient. She says, I cannot compose myself to write any further at present. I will add more as I hear further. And something that is not unusual at all for them at the time, because the transportation of letters is very irregular. They are always talking to one another about how they can get letters back and forth to Philadelphia, but also because in the time people would write before everybody was doing email and Instagram and everything else, people would write, put the thing aside, come back a day or so later and start writing again. So it's Tuesday, it's like 2 days later, on the 20th, and she says, I've been much agitated I've been so much agitated that I have not been able to write since Sabbath day. And then she is much calmer. She again finds some solace in poetry, which I'm not going to read you. This time it's her other recourse that she will go to besides scripture is the poets. And she closes much more conventionally and says at the end, don't really worry too much about, the loss of Charlestown hasn't knocked our spirit out, don't worry. John, meanwhile, is still basking in the glow of General Washington, but he writes to her next, and this delay, this tendency to stop and continue and pick up writing later, we actually get to see him receive that June 18th letter, her famous Bunker Hill letter. It begins like all his other stuff. I have this morning been out of town to accompany our generals Washington, Lee, and Schuyler a little way on their journey. The three generals were all mounted on horseback, accompanied by Major Mifflin, who has gone in the character of aide-de-camp. All the delegates from the Massachusetts and their servants, other delegates, officers, militias, music playing, troop of light horse, uniforms, such is the pride and pomp of war. And then he kind of feels sorry for himself because he doesn't have enough pride and pomp himself. And then he sort of basically says, we've got this kind of rumor going around that maybe something happened recently up there, that there might have been some kind of a battle. Maybe there were some cannons fired, that something may have happened at Bunker Hill. We're trying to track it down. We're a little bit concerned, but if you know anything, please let us know. And that he stops because he can't send the letter off. And then 4 days later, he says, this moment, he picks it up again, this moment, received 2 letters from you. Obviously, the May 8th, 16th, and the May 18th letter. And he says, courage, my dear, we shall be supported in life or comforted in death, or I rejoice that my countrymen behaved so bravely, my love everywhere, John Adams. So when push comes to shove, he kind of comes through, and the talk is a much more serious from there on, I think, between the two of them. So we're going to pick that up a little bit later, and we'll talk a little bit later about why John is so preoccupied that he isn't paying sufficient attention to what Abigail's trying to tell him about how things are going at home and what her state of mind is. But we are now moving on to Colonel, later General Joseph Palmer, frequent moderator of the Braintree Town Meeting. I suppose we could get his resume up, I think, probably, Bob.
Sure.
He's a resident of Germantown. He was involved, he's related in a kind of extended way to John and Abigail. He's married to Mary Cranch, and Abigail's sister is married to Richard Cranch. So they're kind of, an extended family. They were involved in the Germantown Glassworks and Candle Factory, which was unsuccessful. He was an endless member of the Braintree Town Meeting. He was always the moderator. He was the moderator of the Suffolk Resolves Convention. He was, crucially for us, on the Committee of Safety, which is sort of like the National Security Council of Massachusetts during the period when the Provincial Congress is the de facto government. And in that capacity, as Bob points out here, he is the first person to send word of Lexington southward to the other colonies, sending a rider on the morning of April 19th. He may or may not be at Bunker Hill, and we'll get to that later. He wrote a letter, along with other letters, he wrote a letter to John Adams on the 19th of June about the Battle of Bunker Hill, and undoubtedly, he collected those letters that Abigail sent. Abigail's letters of the 18th were undoubtedly picked up by Palmer, who then got them into the pipeline to go south to Philadelphia, along probably with his letter. So in effect, when Adams says, I've received both your letters, he's probably also received the third from Palmer. So Palmer is a little bit like a middle manager. He doesn't pump up to the surface any place, but he's always kind of moving, and for most of the time is quite competent. We may get a chance to talk to him about him a little bit more, but we're on to what actually happened when he sent that Lexington alarm down, which brings us back to Mr. Damon, I think, right?
Yes. One more quick note. It's something that Ed and I obsessed over, was how the heck did Abigail know all this stuff about the Battle of Bunker Hill less than 24 hours after it happened, and she's freaking out on paper writing to her husband? Where did that come from? Well, we really only have one connection that we can think of. It's this guy who everybody says was at Bunker Hill, but we don't even have any evidence on paper that in fact that's where he was. But somehow, this gentleman who's responsible for facilitating a lot of this back and forth that Ed just so beautifully outlined for you between John and Abigail, is in there somewhere. And it's one of those wonderful pieces of this story that we have to kind of use a little bit of our historical imagination to figure out how to pull together. Again, the evidence here is just spotty at best. I'm just going to move this over here a little bit so that we have a little bit better view of the screen. And then, of course, I'm going to come back over here.
Bob, do you want me to see if I can advance it for you? If you just...
Yes. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Yes, maybe you should have that so that we can do that. So we're going to move then, as I promised, back to...
I did so well with my glasses, this will undoubtedly not be a problem.
We're going to move back to April 19th, and we're going to talk a little bit about Braintree on April 19th. So 5 Braintree militia companies marched in response to Benjamin Lincoln's alarm. Did I say Benjamin Lincoln? Excuse me, Joseph Palmer.
No, not yet.
Whoops, go back.
Sorry, I thought you were signaling me to go forward.
Joseph
Sorry.
Palmer's alarm. We do not have any evidence that any of the Braintree militia companies actually participated in fighting on April 19th. They've got to get their act together, and they've got to walk somewhere between 10 and 14 miles. They weren't making it there on time. But they serve a very important purpose, and we see very immediately the mindfulness that organizers on the colonial side have with regard to military strategy. Why? Well, we see these 5 companies, 6 of them in total, being placed in important and strategic locations. Up here at the Cambridge headquarters, and what could have been the alternate route back into Boston. We also have the only way to get off of Boston to march troops out to support what's happening, or to launch a counterattack. So, Braintree militiamen, and one of them, a group of grenadiers under the leadership of Eliphalet Sawin, are patrolling the Dorchester ferry crossings, the ways on and off of Boston from Dorchester Neck. Others are right at the area where the road comes off of Boston Neck and goes into Roxbury to then go off to the east. So the Braintree militia are there. Now, they marched with literally the clothes on their back and their guns. They stayed there for anywhere between 3 and 9 days, depending on what the Committee of Safety told them they should do. So, not surprisingly, for example, our flank guards that are down near Milton under John Vinton's leadership are moved out relatively quickly. And slowly but surely, other groups are moved out. But what are the other groups doing? Particularly in Roxbury, they are starting to dig trenches, and they are starting to dig defensive works to defend against what should be the inevitable arrival of British troops coming out of Boston. So that's the quick down and dirty on our Braintree militia and where they go and how long they're out there. The longest was around 9 days. The shortest was just around 3. That seems a little bit strange, but we also need to think about the fact that these guys are farmers, and it's April 19th. It's planting season. Now, this, you do the next one, I think. This is big trouble if you are in charge of this now impromptu
Oh, come
militia.
on. We haven't moved, right?
We haven't moved, but we need to move one.
There we go. All right.
But before we do that, we are going to hear a little bit about the patriots of color who did march from my colleague, Karima Lewis. Yes, they are. Ed's going to click them down. So go ahead, Ed.
Okay. Just tell me when, and we'll see if it works.
Are you ready for him to click one down?
Yes,
I'm trying.
So I just wanted to say that how does
See if you can.
the African Americans who are living in New England, how do they fit in this story? This is about the freedom of the colonists, and they are tired of the taxes. They are tired of the army occupying their city. And so they have some grievances with the king. And so how do African Americans fit in this story? And so when there's talk about the natural rights of man, African Americans say, we got natural rights of men, you know, and we're being denied those. They also say that they have a right to their freedom, so they write petitions. They say that Phyllis Wheatley helped in the writing of those petitions. They submitted to the Massachusetts legislature, and they are denied. They bring freedom suits into the courts, because if your mother was white or Native American, you had a right to your freedom, but that wasn't always recognized. And so when the war starts, why would these men say, well, we want to join into this? I need all of it if they can put it.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Why would we join in? We're enslaved. They say we don't have natural rights. They say that the freedom suits are not going to give us freedom. But they wanted to, as any human being, want to change the circumstances of their lives. Now, I'm going to tell you just a little bit of outside history. We know that in the South, when Governor Dunmore makes his claim, come fight with me with the British Army and I'll free you. Oh, so they ran in droves in the South, okay, droves, trying to get that freedom. But New England and the North didn't offer that. A couple of states, Rhode Island, I believe, and perhaps New York, did offer freedom after some time. So if you're not going to get your freedom, why would you say, I'm going to pick up and fight? Because people would have known that maybe there's a chance. Maybe this war and them getting free from the king and what they're suffering under, maybe they'll think twice and free me. So I'm going to take my chance. And it was an opportunity for men to not be doing what enslaved people have to do. And that's work all the time and not get paid. Because they got paid and they joined the forces. So I just wanted to go back a little bit to the Battle of Lexington and Concord. We know that there were about, I think, 10 or 12 African Americans that fought during that battle. I just highlighted a few of them. Silas Perdue, he fought in the battle. He served with the 9th Mass Regiment during the Battle of Bunker Hill, and his unit was the nearby Charleston Common. Cesar Ferret and his son, I think there were 2 sons, but I read it a little further, Thomas and John, who also fought. He was from Natick. Well, he was from Boston originally, and him and his wife moved around. The wife was Native American descendant, and so I think she had that connection to Natick, which was a praying town. And so he also marched, and he has an interesting story, which I didn't really include here. When the battle was going on, him and his son ran and took cover near a house, and they were able to come out after a while, but they took cover because of all that was going on. And Prince Estabrooks, who was wounded, he was an enslaved man who stood with his white neighbors against the British Army, and it is likely that Prince was the son of a man named Tony, who was enslaved by the Estabrook family. Now, when the war is over, Prince returns to Lexington, he is still enslaved for a while. So when he was born around 1740, he became the property of Benjamin Estabrook. Benjamin's family lived just east of the Lexington Center. So he remains with that family in the post-war.
Yep. Okay, so we are now moving our way forward. Just a little bit of a snapshot here. We will be hearing more from Karima about Patriots of Color from Braintree as well. There is only one who marches with those various companies to their various placements. But before we do that, we're going to be talking a little bit about the problem of having farmers as your army, particularly having them in springtime. And so pretty quickly, the Committee of Safety, including Colonel Palmer, have to figure out what they're going to do to make sure that they can maintain what is now this siege around Boston. You can see from the map here, it is, I'm cheating a little bit, this map is from later on, but you get a good sense of what, if you look at it and look carefully, stretching from all the way from the Charlestown Peninsula all the way down to Roxbury down here at the bottom of the picture there, you can see the various pieces of the siege lines themselves. And I'm referring to, we have here Boston Neck. Okay, Dorchester Heights is actually right here. Here is where the narrow neck comes here, and Roxbury is here. To the south is modern-day Quincy, it's Braintree. And the roadways around here to Cambridge, you can see the various forts and what we now know of as the hills of Cambridge and Somerville. And here we have that isthmus that is where Charlestown is located, with this very narrow neck here in between the Mystic River and the Charles River. So the siege is now all around this area. How are we going to maintain this? First of all, when we have guys who are hanging out in nothing but the clothes they had on their backs, and we've got to figure out how to keep this army contained in Boston. I have to come over here and press the button the right way. So how are we going to keep them there? So, like any good legislature would do, in April of '75, the Provincial Congress called for the creation of what they called an Army of Observation. It's more often known as the Provincial Army. And they called for, interestingly, 3 other states to show up with men. They said, hey, Massachusetts is going to contribute 13,500, and we need New Hampshire, Connecticut, or Rhode Island to contribute the rest. They didn't do too badly. And not that much longer, they would have 24,000. Off I go over here, and I press the wrong button again. So, really quickly, since one of the trickiest thing about this historical time period is the various colloquialisms that get used for all these various things. Under the plan, as I said, Massachusetts was going to contribute 13,500 soldiers. Okay? And remember, they've got to do all this by the old-fashioned snail mail. So they're making this announcement at the end of April. Most of these companies won't even start to get formed until the middle to late May. Okay? As towns get their act together, they have to meet. You know, that's like, if you've ever had to organize a meeting, you start to multiply that times 500, and you have the issues of organizing these various militias. These companies were referred to the 8-month companies because their terms were going to end at the end of 1775. All right, see if I can push the button on the right direction this way. Okay. And now we come back specifically to Braintree. So in Braintree, there will be 3 or 4 of these companies. And eventually they will come up with an independent one. And they're in the middle of organizing these companies in May of '75. And as Abigail says, I got woken up at around 6 in the morning with all kinds of hustle and bustle and guns being shot off and bells ringing. And I had no idea what was going on. Well, what was going on was that 2 armed sloops and a schooner had showed up down here at Grape Island. Now, because everybody's still getting their act together, this isn't an official battle. This is a skirmish in which an organic group of militiamen who are thinking about going off to fight all respond to an alarm that they've set off themselves. And what's happening? The British soldiers who have landed on Grape Island are there to get hay. They've been invited there by a loyalist from Hingham named Leavitt, who owns the island, and encouraged the soldiers to come down to take all the hay off his island to be able to bring back to the besieged town of Boston. They have to wait because there's a low tide, and they can't get from the mainland out to Grape Island. So they have to wait, and they're watching, and they're waiting, and then they jump in boats, and they go across, and they start shooting, and they drive the soldiers off of Grape Island. There it is, the massive battle of Grape Island. One of the first guys in the first boat, a guy by the name of Elihu. Just so happens to be the younger brother of a guy who's down doing a little bit of congressing in Philadelphia. Elihu Adams is one of the first ones. Abigail will report to John that both of his brothers actually responded to the alarm and were involved. Elihu manages to get himself on the first boat, though. Now, when they get to the island, to ensure that the British are not going to get access to resources again, they burn roughly 80 tons of hay, as well as Levitt's barns. And that's a little bit of retribution. And they also, for retribution, decide that it's well worth it for them to, shall we say, conscript some cows. So here is, but I think what Ed had been referencing for you earlier was this a notion of the emotional tension that people all of a sudden find themselves existing in, right? Nobody knows, and everybody's living in fear of exactly what Abigail describes. Guns going off, some kind of thing's going to happen. British soldiers walking down, who knows, from Squantum Neck or wherever they're going to come from and marching into their town because it's so close. So there's this real palatable feeling that comes from this. And in fact, for the militia, this is a good thing. Because the fact that there's an alarm in their community means that doing the recruiting is a little bit easier. But I think it's important for us to remember, and what we want to bring to you tonight is this sense of what is it like to be here when the revolution has begun. It's in their front yard. They are experiencing it emotionally, security-wise, in all sorts of ways. And we're going to be talking some more about that. Okay, get the right. And one group of people who have an even more difficult time here in Braintree are those who don't agree with this separatist military uprising that's happening. And one of the things that the Provincial Congress puts out is an order for all towns to make a strict inquiry after persons whose behavior renders them justly suspected of unfriendly intentions, and if necessary, disarm them. And, as we said to you before, a committee was appointed by the North Precinct of the town to consider and determine upon some means preventive of danger that otherwise might ensue to the common cause from those that have appeared in opposition, offered to the town a draft that they had prepared to be offered to such persons for signing, which was approved by the town and ordered to be committed to Norton Quincy Esquire for that design. One of the, shall we say, elite members of the community, Mr. Norton Quincy, is to be put to the question as a wonderful example. Now, before I move on, why is this a unique problem for Braintree? Can anybody help me out with this? I'm sorry, I'm a recovering high school teacher. I end up asking questions. So, why is this a big deal for Braintree? Is it something that's different in Braintree than in other communities nearby?
They had Christ Church.
They had Christ Church, yes. They had a missionary Anglican congregation, Society for the Propagation of the Gospel congregation, and, by the way, the oldest continuously operating Episcopal congregation in Massachusetts. There is not one older in Boston or anywhere else. And it was right here in the North Parish. Braintree's town meeting takes these directives seriously. And over the course of time after April, they would very specifically pass various orders to deal with these persons who were deemed to be inimical to the town. Specific purchases for specific pieces to petition for the Borland and Vassal woodlots and to inventory Tory property. We don't know how they decided whose property was Tory property and whose wasn't. So draw up a list of persons of doubtful principles. Votes. They voted for a trade embargo on anyone who was provisioning British troops. And a formal list of, I love that word, inimical persons. Inimical persons, excuse me. And if you were on that list, you received no relief from the town. You received no support. Imagine that. You are living in a place where others in public town meeting are standing in judgment of you because your opinions are different than theirs. This is a part of the reality of life in Braintree at the start of the American Revolution. Who's this guy? Anybody know? No, you are not allowed to answer, Alexander. Who's this handsome gentleman here? Samuel Quincy, who had been doing quite well for himself thanks to a royal appointment. So he is not necessarily a member of the congregation, but as we talked about, the North Precinct had this Anglican congregation and minority that was centered on Christ Church. And because if you were a member of that church, you swore a loyalty oath to the king, it meant that that house of worship was definitely a place where loyalism was happening. Braintree also lies on the main north-south route. They're very fearful that supplies and other kinds of things are going to go in and out of Boston. By the way, you could go in and out of Boston during the siege. People would go back and forth on the ferries all the time. There wasn't necessarily a prohibition against doing that. There was a very porous, shall we say, boundary. And several high-profile loyalist gentry, so elite members of the community, Samuel Quincy being one, Peter Eder not necessarily being one, but Anna Vassal Borland definitely one, they left early on. They said, we're out of here. And that creates a precedent. Oh, what did I just do now? Come on. What did I just do? There we go. Yes. So what, if you were a loyalist, if you were someone who wasn't in support of this separatist rebellion, what could you do? Well, if you were living in Braintree at the time, these are basically your choices. You can get out of Dodge, and you can go into town, which isn't a much better option, but at least it's away from people who are calling you names. You can leave altogether, go to Canada. That would happen. A lot of what we know about people from Boston, by the way, comes from genealogy today done by people up in the Canadian provinces. You could stay put and say, no, I'm not swearing to anything. And keep your fingers crossed behind your back. You could take the oath. Sure, all right, I'm going to do it, fine. I would really like to have groceries. Or you could go the other way altogether and actually join up and be an activist. And then there are those who really just tried to, I'm just going to be over here. And keep their head low. But these are the options. Do those sound good to you?
Make it to New
Not
York.
particularly.
Make it to New York, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you could, get out of town with as much of your stuff as you possibly could and head to some place like New York,
Yeah.
as Karima just mentioned. So it's not just the tension and the fear of British troops that members of this community have. There are many who are in fear of their own neighbors.
Hmm.
And they're in fear of their neighbors on both sides. So we have these divisions. Some of those old social structures that are a part of this community are beginning to get pulled apart by these events. And political divisions are creating divisions in neighbors, friends, cousins, brothers, and sisters. I'll go back just for a second here. Samuel here will leave to go to Boston and will never, ever see his children or his wife again. His father will write letters to his one and only other son, who is still alive, but will only be alive for about another 5 weeks, and says, Samuel's still not getting it. Please don't say anything mean to him. Maybe we could get him back. And it doesn't work. But this gentleman right here will never, ever see his family again. All right.
All right.
So with that tension in mind, we are going to shift, take a big swing, and we're going to leave Braintree, and we're going to go back down to Philadelphia
Right.
with Ed.
Okay, so we're back to John and Abigail, and we're going to try and take a look now at what had John so preoccupied down in Philadelphia that had him so less than fulsome for Abigail. A couple of things to say at the beginning here. Probably the most complete account of John Adams and his thought and his activity during the Second Continental Congress actually comes from his autobiography, which was a book, a autobiography he wrote, not intending it for publication. He wrote it primarily for his family, and he wrote it in 1802, so 27 years after these events take place and after he has already been president and lost the presidency. And it's there to set the record straight. So we're going to quote a fair amount from what he says in the autobiography. One of the things that he says, somewhat memorably, is that the battle at Lexington on April 19th, after that, the weapons of the conflict switched from the pen to the sword. And that's true, obviously. Up until that date in April, there had been a lot of political maneuvering, there had been a lot of discussion. Adams himself was writing and getting himself entangled into trying to figure out exactly how and what we're doing here and how do we justify it and what's the ideology and what are the underlying principles that we're seeking to defend. In his Nov-Angles essays, and in fact the last Nov-Angles essay got spiked because the Battle of Lexington and Concord intervened and it never got printed. So after that, all that kind of goes away in any kind of overt way, and it's obviously a struggle for survival. It's a struggle to just make sure that we win and we get what we want. However, what is it that we want? And that is still a question that is hanging out there and people are still not that clear on. And it brings us to something that I think we still see and how hard it is for people to do what these people are about to do. How hard it is really finally to say, we're gone, it's over, we're going our own way, we are independent. And how, even when they think they're doing it, how much they're still kind of hanging on. In general, the language that people are using here, politically, even in the deliberations of the Continental Congress and in the Provincial Congress, it's a combination of defiant and careful. Nobody yet is using the word revolution. They're still talking about a civil war. The Provincial Congress still talks about changes for the foreseeable future, even in internal documents like maybe this won't go on forever, maybe things will actually somehow go back to where they were. And then the Americans still keep saying we're fighting against ministerial tyranny, still making a distinction between the parliament and the ministry and the king, they still are wary about going after the king. Now, some of this may be strategic because there are obviously advantages in negotiation and in political posturing to being a little bit different. But John Adams says in 1802 that he had a different idea. He said that after Lexington and Concord, after he had gone out and ridden the road from Cambridge out to Concord and looked at the aftermath, and a few days after the battle, he said it clarified his thinking. He says, the die was cast, the Rubicon passed, and as Lord Mansfield expressed it in Parliament, if we did not defend ourselves, they would kill us. Adams says that he entered the Second Continental Congress committed to independence. There is reason to have a grain of doubt about that, but we can come back to that later. And then this is what he says his agenda was when he walked in on that first day. It appeared to me that all petitions, remonstrances, and negotiations for the future would be fruitless and only occasion a loss of time and give opportunity to the enemy to sow divisions. That we ought to recommend to the people of all the states to institute governments for themselves under their own authority. We ought to recommend to the people of all the states to institute governments for themselves under their own authority. That we ought to declare the colonies free, sovereign, and independent states, and then to inform Great Britain we were willing to enter into negotiations with them for the redress of all grievances and a restoration of harmony between the two countries upon permanent principles. There's more, there's a little bit more detail, which for the sake of just keeping us all sane, we're leaving out. And then he comes to his most immediate point, which he actually states last in the summary, but is the next thing that is most important to him. Yay, we did it. That we ought immediately to adopt the army in Cambridge as a continental army, to appoint a general and all other officers, take upon ourselves the pay, subsistence, clothing, armor, and munitions of the troops. This is a concise sketch of the plan, which I thought the only reasonable one. And I was then convinced, and have ever since been convinced, that it was the general sense, at least of a considerable majority of the body. This system of measures I publicly and privately avowed without reserve. All right, let's take him at his word. There is some suggestion by the editor of the Adams papers that he is 27 years later mixing a little bit of 75 and 76 together, but let's just take him at his word for right now. So he claims he's pushing hard, but with what is really an understandable political development, there is a reaction. But now people began to see that independence was approaching and they started back. And the leader of the starting back, in his opinion, is John Dickinson, who is, I think most people know, not quite the villain he appears in 1776. He's a much more complicated guy than that, but is certainly trying to break and, if possible, stop independence right from the get-go. There's a letter here that he writes right after Lexington and Concord to a friend, in which he says, oh, for Christ's sakes, look what they've done now. Now we're going to wind up independence, and after all the work I've been trying to keep it from happening. So he's still working at it. The instrument that he is using is what becomes known as the Olive Branch Petition, that in late May, it's formally introduced into the Congress, and he's been politicking. Adams claims he's politicking, he's peeling off South Carolinians, and he's peeling off North Carolinians and other people. And we could get much more into that. There's a definite view on his part, on Adams's part, that the men of property are kind of loading the deck to kind of preserve their options. And the notion is that they will send one last appeal to the king for reconciliation, for it doesn't really have to be like this. And meanwhile, Adams is trying to get them to do this, to have the Continental Congress adopt the army in Boston and make it a national army, and to put a general in charge so there will be one commanding general in charge of all the armies. And the Olive Branch Petition, in Adams's opinion, is just eating up time. Adams says in the quite startling, when I read this, I was actually quite startled. In 1802, again in the autobiography, Adams says, "I have always imputed the loss of Charlestown and of the brave officers and men who fell there, and the loss of a hero of more worth than all the town, I mean General Warren, to Mr. Dickinson's petition to the king, to his subsequent, though finally unavailing efforts against independence. These impeded and paralyzed all our enterprises." Fair enough, fair or not, it's what he felt. And in June 14th and June 15th and June 16th, just at the moment that Bunker Hill is about to happen, he finally gets it through. On the 14th, as we know now, Congress raises troops, 6 companies of expert riflemen, and commits that they are going to Boston. And the next day, June 15th, at Adams's urging and his famous nomination speech, for which we only have his own account to justify, they named Washington the commander of all the armies, and he will go to Boston. The Olive Branch petition still makes its way along. It's finally passed, somewhat ironically, on July 5th, given what's going to happen a year later, but and it's sent out on July 8th. Just one or two things there. So that explains the kind of high that I think Adams is on in those letters to Abigail that just seem so odd to us because of the crisscross that we opened with. He is genuinely high because he's finally achieved what was his real goal for this first part of the Second Continental Congress. I would also we don't have to go back to the screen, but I would also notice something that struck me in what he says in that sort of ringing declaration, even 27 years later, as he summarizes his position. "We ought to declare the colonies free, sovereign, and independent states, and then to inform Great Britain we were willing to enter into negotiations with the redress of all grievances and a restoration of harmony between the two countries." So he's imagining something. And I think even though he's writing long after the United States is formed, I think he's going back to what that feeling was. There is some feeling that they can't, it's not just that they can't quite let go of the king, because he's more than willing to let go of the king, I think, at this point, but they can't quite let go of their Englishness yet. And I think that's interesting. Abigail, even at the same time, in one of her letters sort of says, she's writing to a man in England that is sympathetic, and it basically says, we've got to save both nations, we just can't save one. So something is hanging on there, and they haven't quite gotten all the way there yet, for all that Adams is sort of wanting to take the credit, partly because he wants to scoop Tom Paine, partly because he wants to scoop Thomas Jefferson by 1802. But it's also, I think, kind of real. And we'll see a little bit how that plays out, maybe just one more time. But we're going back to the action now. Enough of theory, back to action.
Oops. Except now I keep going too fast. And now I can't get back. Okay. So we come back to the scene that John has been talking about and worried about. This provincial army, which has a provisional funding system, it has a provisional organizational system, it has different states with different hierarchies and different generals who claim that they have longer tenure than others. There's all kinds of craziness going on in this particular siege army. Braintree's 8-month soldiers, where are they at this time? Because we're coming back again to being here in the community and grounded in the community. Our sons, our husbands, our cousins, our brothers, our fathers are there. So where are they? Silas Wilde's company, one of the most important ones, is at Fort Number 2. That is right up here, in between the hills in Somerville, in Cambridge, and Artemis Ward's headquarters in Cambridge. And their job is to defend the headquarters there. Now, one of the, again, I referenced a certain gentleman by the name of Aaron Hayward. who has a diary that was preserved related to his experiences, and related to his experiences in Silas Wilde's company. And he has some wonderful and interesting pieces, which of course I'm very regretful that I can't share with you, but I'll do so anecdotally. And he tells us a little bit about what it's like to be in camp. The first thing that you had to do was sign a promise that you weren't going to drink in your tent and you weren't going to have women in your tent. That's the first thing that you had to do once you got to camp. And the consequence for that, for each one of those things, was that you would lose your ration of rum. So we know apparently where this guy's priorities are. But he also talks about other really fascinating elements of what it must have been like to be a farmer and know that you had crops or other things to deal with. He mentions in his diary things like a gentleman by the name of Samuel Spear. Spear Street, right down here behind the library, that's the Spear family, and that's where their farm was. Samuel Spear paid him 8 pence to take up one of his guard shifts so he could hoof it back home. So he records some of those various pieces and talks about them. Again, a really interesting window into what life is like in this siege army. So we have we still have some grenadiers, which I think is fascinating to me. Captain John Vinton's Grenadiers. The Grenadiers, by the way, they are the elite troops. Okay, so they are the Army Rangers, they are the airborne, the equivalent of this type of troops. And they are still in and around Dorchester and the ferries to Dorchester and those important areas strategically. Captain Elihu Adams' company is going to be up on Prospect Hill overlooking what is and will be the locations of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And then Seth Turner's Seacoast Company, we can't see where they are, but they're actually hanging out either in Squam, out on Moon Island, or they're out in Nantasket and Hull, where Fort Revere is, if you know where that is. Those are their two various sites, and their job was looking for various other foraging parties, potential invading forces, scouts, other things like that in Boston Harbor. So we have this group of almost 300 men from this community whose job it is to be very active in different ways in keeping and maintaining the siege in different components of what's happening. And again, while these companies do not actually fight in the Battle of Bunker Hill, we do not know of any evidence of any of the companies being in that battle, they are maintaining a really important aspect of a system which will eventually lead General Gage and his companions to say, there is nothing to be gained in Boston. This is a system that these men are participating in. It's very active, it's very diligent, and despite its level of disorganization, ends up being highly effective. Okay, I do this with my glasses, I did this with the clicker. So, as it is the anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill, we also need to talk about the events that lead to that occupation. So the first of them is the arrival of reinforcements. 3 generals and about 2,000 troops show up in Boston. Second, I told you it's a very porous border between the two sides of the siege, right? And so members of the Committee of Safety will learn about British plans, now that they have their reinforcements, to break out of the siege. 2 ways they're going to go. Dorchester and Charlestown. Sorry. There we go. And this sets off a debate amongst the leadership. What do we do? If they're going to go 2 directions, what do we do? How are we going to defend this? How are we going to deal with this? These guys aren't ready for any of this. They're just farmers. They've done a good job digging trenches, but they're not going to be able to fight. And there is finally a decision to occupy Bunker Hill. Now, before that decision has even really been fully reinforced, The Committee of Safety, including our good friend Colonel Palmer, comes in and says, will you stop talking about this already? Just go fortify Bunker Hill. And they issue a specific directive to go and to fortify the hill, which they will do on an overnight on June 16th. But before that, General Gage decides it's a really good idea to see if he can scare enough people into just simply surrendering and giving up. And he writes, well, actually, is it Burgoyne who writes it, Ed?
Yeah.
Yeah, so General Burgoyne, a real blowhard, comes in and writes this official declaration that is issued and sent out to all the newspapers around Massachusetts, and in which it does something that's just, well, gee, surprise, surprise, he declares martial law. While he's besieged in Boston, he's declaring martial law for the entire colony of Massachusetts. And he offers a pardon to anybody who would lay down their arms and return their allegiance, with two exceptions. A certain guy named Sam and another guy named John. The language is really blunt. It's meant to be scary and sound really dangerous. And it sounds a little bit like this. The law is therefore open to receive such as may seek to avoid the calamities of war by returning to the duties of obedience. Ooh. To such, mercy and encouragement are held out. But the infatuated leaders whose guilt is too I can't even say that word, flagitious, a nature to admit of any of the other consideration than that of condign punishment, will be accepted from this pardon. Like me, I'm guessing half the audience who read that didn't even know what he was talking about. So, now we get to the day itself. We get to today, which, as Alexander has already pointed out, is long over by now. Overnight, on June 16th, they build fortifications. They're assigned to go to Bunker Hill. But the guys decide to go down here to Breeds Hill. And they actually build their fortifications on Breeds Hill. And they think it's a really good place to be at night until the sun comes up and they look and they see that they are at a place where they can be completely surrounded. Whoops, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Now, when that happens, you perhaps know that famous letter from Abigail talking about hearing cannon endlessly, and they come early in the morning. As soon as the first light happens, the firing on those fortifications begins. So from that very moment until the end of the battle, we have various batteries firing on these positions that have been set up with these various members. I'm not going to go through any more detail. You can get much better detail from a lot of other sources than myself. I'm moving through it relatively quickly. The first British assault happens at 3 p.m. There had been a debate amongst the British leaders about the best way to deal with this pesky troop that had to be removed from its area here. The smart generals said, let's just sail around, go up here. This area floods at high tide. We'll just meet up here, we'll close this off, and then we can deal with them as we need. General Howe says, no, no, no. We're going to do this the right way. A frontal assault. And that's what they do. Obviously, the first of those didn't go so well. It would fail at around 3 p.m. They try again half an hour later. This one also fails. The last one would succeed. By that point, the British are done shooting. They simply say, we are going to take our superior numbers, we are going to take bayonets, and we're just going to run and overrun the Americans, who have quite literally run out of powder, ammunition, and many of whom who have been there without water, food, provisions since 10, 11 p.m. on the 16th. As Alexandra mentioned, this is a very bloody battle. Over 1,000 casualties, including 90 British officers killed or wounded. Proportionately, somewhere around 450 casualties for the American forces. And again, as Alexandra mentioned earlier on, the casualty rate for the British in particular would be one of the highest of any of the battles that would eventually ensue in the American Revolution. Thanks to General Howe's assumption that just simply walking up to those colonials was going to scare the Jesus out of them. Again, I'm doing a quick overview here because our orientation really is to Braintree. And now I'm going to pass it off to Karima once again to come in with another group of soldiers who are very active and well known to have been very active in this battle.
Okay, so what I wanted to do before I do this is just kind of tell some of the numbers so you could understand how many people of color, blacks I'm talking about specifically, are in Boston, and not so much Boston, but New England. So there's a census that's done around 1750, and I believe Quincy has, and correct me, 60, about 60?
I think a little over 70. Maybe.
About 70 enslaved people in Quincy. But if you look at all of the New England colonies, the numbers were around, so if you read the census, it'll say 15,000. But Jared Hardesty and I had a discussion about that, and we said it's about 20,000 because they don't count children under 16 in that census. And so we came to agree that it might have been about 20,000. But in the whole, I can't say United States because it's not United States, but in all of the colonies, the 13 colonies, it's 5,000 enslaved people at that time. So you gotta, if you put the South in there, those numbers rise. But also, I didn't talk about New York or.
Did you say 500,000? Is that what you said?
Yeah, 500,000.
500,000.
Yeah, I'm sorry. What did I say?
5,000.
Bad. It's about 500,000. We know that number after the American Revolution, it goes up to 700,000, and by the Civil War, it's going to be 4 million. And so it's a steady increase. And I just want to say one thing about loyalists. There are some black loyalists as well. You know, not only the ones running to the British, but even in New England, when a group of African American men, I think many of them had maybe signed that petition asking the legislator to set them free, meet with General Gage and say, we're on your side. You know, we want to be on your side. So, and there are blacks being taken out of the colonies by their enslavers who are loyalists. And so they have no choice in the matter, but they also, so, you know, just bringing these underrepresented voices into the picture. So let's just talk about patrons of color for the Battle of Bunker Hill. I tell you, I think Bob and I researched as much as we could research, trying to find some soldiers from Quincy that would be in this numbers, but for all those reasons that he gave for the logistics of what's going on in the military, there does not seem to be any. But there were other blacks that were in this battle. Blacks and whites are standing together to withstand this deadly assault that takes place. It's estimated, there's a good study done by a historian where he goes into the depth of identifying many of the 103 blacks that he found fighting at Bunker Hill. But the number has been estimated to be as high as 150 that participated in this battle. Best known is Peter Salem of Framingham, who distinguished himself by killing British Major John Pitcairn. Also well known, Salem Poor, Prince Whipple from New Hampshire, William Lee, and Black Samson. I have the wrong picture there. That should be a Lexington picture, I think.
I know, we just be.
Where's the other picture that I had of Peter Salem? You showed it to me.
Well, we have this.
Oh, yeah.
This doesn't like me. Oh, no. Okay, I'm just going manual.
You just got to go back, right?
I am ruining our dramatic ending there.
That's why I haven't touched it. So maybe you can point out, Bob, the
Yes, so
black
the-
individual in this painting, John
Right, you
Trumbull.
can see right where my finger is there.
Right there.
He
And so
he is holding a rifle, and he's also pulling this gentleman away from
from fire.
the fight.
And so you see there's evidence of that black soldier fighting. But I wanted to show the picture of Peter Salem, which is next.
That may be my fault, Karima.
Huh?
It may be my fault that the picture you're expecting isn't there.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. Some of the things got mixed up, but that's okay. So Patriots of Color, and this is not necessarily Branch. Oh, why did Peter say, I did an all-nighter, I want you to know that. And Peter he should have been on the picture before. So this is Peter Salem. He is from Framingham. He's the one that killed the major, and he's only 25 years old, fighting at Bunker Hill, and so he's relatively young. He'll stay with the Army after this battle, but he is best known for that. He said that he just had a good position, and he shot the major directly in the chest. So that's Peter Salem. Okay, so these are the Patriots of Color that we, and mostly I have to say Bob, has located, that we know lived in Quincy and was involved in the war. And so the first one is Fortune Black. I'm not going to read all of it, but he's in a regiment and he sees action at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, I think that's how it's called, and Rhode Island. Now, one thing about, we're going to be looking further at the Battle of Monmouth because the statistics that are given for that battle for soldiers of color is as high as 700, or 5%, and I forget the large number of total soldiers it is, but 5% of that total. And so we're going to be looking very closely, and I think some of the soldiers from Braintree will be in that Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. Nero Blanchard, I understand the Blanchard name is a very famous name in Quincy, and so trying to find out that connection between him and that family. The 28th Mass Regiment, he built fortifications at Prospect Hill and Winter Hill. Now, the records list this soldier as Mr. Caesar. And he served for 3 years for the 5th Suffolk Company from April 14, 1781. Now, this first name is very different. And so Regia Malia, H. Crispy, we haven't located his records yet, but we have his name. It's listed in the soldiers and sailors records that we've looked at. Cornelius, and they have Cornwallis there, so I don't know if they're thinking that was the same first name, but Cornwallis could be a last name. He served for 3 years from 1221, 1780 to 327, 1781. Another interesting name, Regimelech, Cushing, Sword Action in Fishkill, Rhode Island, 1775 to 1780. Exeter, Dolby, we have not located his records. Did
There we
you?
go.
Okay. Now they list this one as Minister Samuel Dunbar. He served with the 5th Suffolk Company from age 17, from 1779 to 1780. Cornwall Freedman served 3 years, from December 1780 to March 1781. James Holland, he also enlisted at the age of 17 and served from June of 1780 to December of 81 in the artillery unit, which is significant because most of the blacks that enlisted were in the infantry divisions. They weren't in the skilled position units. Prince Pero, he joined from Braintree and Bridgewater and served in Josiah Bass's regiment for 2 days. And that was 1776 to, in 1776 to drive British ships out of Boston Harbor. Pompey, who's a private in Captain Seth Turner's company, and Colonel Benjamin Lincoln from Hingham regiment, which marched on alarm April 19th from the South Precinct in Braintree. And Cato Rawson, he was engaged in Braintree for also the 5th Suffolk Company, which served for 3 years until April of 80. April of
Should be 81.
81. So I think Bob could tell you more about the 5th Suffolk Company that I see that a lot of them joined up with to give you the details of that.
But we have more. So from what you can see here, many of the patrons of color from Braintree are getting engaged as the Continental Army ramps up and as Continental Army service begins to ramp up. And as we continue on with our State of Rebellion series, you will certainly be hearing more about them, not only as we find more of their paths and their pathways, which are not always easy to find, but as we continue to talk about Braintree and its relationship to the Revolution.
And I just would add there are Native Americans that can be found for Lexington and Concord, as well as Bunker Hill as well.
Okay, and we come full circle in our evening this evening. We appreciate your attention. We know it has been a longer evening tonight. We have tried to pack a lot of stuff into this particular presentation tonight. And we come full circle and back to where we began with Ed and with Abigail and with Mr. Palmer.
So we end with some of the after effects of the Battle of Bunker Hill. One, of course, is the Provincial Congress recognized that they had a potential propaganda victory in a loss in which the conquering army suffered as much as they did. So they prepared a report for the Continental Congress that would also serve as a propaganda tool, particularly to be sent to England. And our old friend, the ubiquitous but somehow somewhat anonymous Joseph Palmer, is probably not the writer, but he's sort of like the managing editor for the Committee of Safety. He kind of puts the whole thing, gets the whole thing together and knows enough to get some people that know how to write to do it. And we also see, again, I would just make the point that I made earlier when we were talking about John and the Continental Congress, the still slightly tentative element in that declaration there as to where they really want to go. They're almost there, but they're just holding on a little bit. But it's also, we're moving forward. We are now the Continental troops. We're no longer the armies and the militias and the 8 months people around Boston. We are the Continental troops. nobly animated by the justice of their cause, strongly urge to decide the contest by the sword. But we wish no further effusion of blood if the freedom of peace of America can be secured. Let's try that again. But we wish no further effusion of blood if the freedom and peace of America can be secured without it. But if it must be otherwise, we are determined to struggle and disdain life without liberty. So rousing. And then from Abigail, something slightly more modulated, but perhaps a little bit more significant and substantial. One of the things that you can see when you really follow Abigail's letters and all that, Bob summed up very effectively what I was trying to get at about the kind of tension and state of anxiety in which they were living up until that. The Battle of Bunker Hill kind of resolves that, just in the same way that John said, Lexington clarified my thinking. Abigail pulls it together in a really strong way after the battle and after that May 18th letter. And by July 5th, she's saying, I would also say, something that has been kind of a hidden theme in this that we haven't really talked about is the loss of Joseph Warren. It has come up so many different times in different places. I don't think we understand that because he's not important to us in the way that he was clearly important to at least many of these people. So I think we also have to understand that this is like, within our frame of reference, it's like the JFK assassination or something, that suddenly, or losing Lincoln at the end of the Civil War. This is somebody that they were really counting on who's now not there. And it's the qualified hope in Abigail's statement that I think is really sort of quite interesting, as well as the calm that she now offers to John. I would not have you be distressed about me. Danger, they say, makes people valiant. Hitherto, I have been distressed, but not dismayed. I have felt for my country and her sons. I have bled with them and for them. Not all the havoc and devastation they have made has wounded me like the death of Warren. We wanted him in the Senate. We want him in his profession. We want him in the field. We mourn for the citizen, the senator, the physician, and the warrior. May we have others raised up in his room, in his place, in other words. Abigail to John on July 5th, 1775. So they're looking forward. I turn it back over to our main host here. Yeah.
That's where we end our story for part 2, and to be continued.
Yeah.
So thank
exactly.
you very much for coming. We've
Not
done
bad.
it again, Ed. We've used up all of our,
Well,
what's supposed to be our question and answer time. But are there some questions or thoughts or things that folks would like to bring up before we close things out for the evening?
One, the conflicts within the African American community, were there ever any, not battles, but physical confrontations between loyalists, blacks, and those who joined the rebel cause?
You talk about in New England?
Yeah.
I don't think there were enough identified loyalists in the black community like it was in the South.
Okay.
Okay, so, but right over in New Jersey, there's a loyalist who was trying to make it to Dunbar's army, but he couldn't get there. So he had this brigade that would attack rebel farms, and so he was a fierce pain. So his name was Colonel Ty. His name was Titus, but he had a whole brigade that just went on the attack and made their lives very miserable over in New Jersey. So that's the only, I think, active resistance that I can think of.
Yes.
In one of the other slides, one of the black soldiers was a slave for Mr. Estabrook. I presume he was indentured to fight. How many other black soldiers were indentured to fight?
Why do you presume Estabrook was indentured?
Mr. Estabrook owned the slave that was forced to fight.
Okay, because we usually say indentured, if you're indentured servant, you always.
Well, he had a slave fight, so how many other slaves were forced to fight?
Oh, well, there were many that fought either along with their enslaver or they fought in their place. Now, I can't give you numbers, but but there were quite a few that took place, I think in the North and the South.
And it's not uncommon. And when we get into the time where they are recruiting now for the larger Continental Army, and you start to get into bounties, the enslaver is receiving both the bounty for their enslaved individuals to join the army, as well as receiving that enslaved individual's pay.
Yeah. That
So-
happened in the beginning, more so, and then I think they were able to sometimes get their pay. And, initially it started out for some that way, but not for all. Some of them got their salaries. And I would just like to add that Black participation starts as early as the 7 Years' War that we call the French and Indian War. There's evidence of Blacks fighting in that war as well from New England.
Oh, she had a question about, was Warren's body? Oh, go ahead first.
What were the major events then between June 75 and March of 76? Were the major battles?
Were there major battles in the Boston area? Do you
Yeah.
mean mostly small skirmishes?
But
but-
when is Princeton and
Princeton
Trenton?
is December of 76, yeah.
But between,
He said till March 76.
Yeah.
yeah, so, but you're referring to in the Boston area, correct? Not said outside.
Not
of-
New England? I mean, North.
So just in the Boston area itself, there will be small skirmishes related to the siege, but particularly after the cost of Bunker Hill, generally speaking, the British leadership is beginning to see Boston as being an unproductive location to be, from a military point of view, from a strategic point of view, and in lots of other ways. And they would eventually, they're going to make a strategic retreat out of Boston. But they are slowly, as Ed was talking about, on the continental side, people are slowly moving their way towards certain things. Bunker Hill really is a turning point or a seminal turning point for the British military leadership in thinking about how they're going to approach this engagement and what is now very clearly going to be a war in North America. And so what's happening, they don't venture out too far and push too hard within Boston before they eventually decide to leave.
Well, Howe wants to move to New York, apparently.
Yeah, that's what I was
Yeah,
thinking, Long
Yes.
Island.
Early on,
Long-
yeah.
Battle of Long
When
Island.
did they move it to New York? Was that 76?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, once they're out of here, yeah. And
Yeah,
then-
our next
and then
chapter
it's
will
like
be
right-
about the time period from when
Right.
we've wrapped up here through until
Right.
when the British leave Boston. That will be part 3, I think. Although I haven't roped that into it yet.
And they go south. They go south.
Yes?
Could you talk about the desecration of a woman's body by the British after they died?
Oh, Ed, do you want to take that one on a little bit?
This is one of the things that we were puzzling over, and I think, Bob, you mentioned it early on, but who seems to know what about Warren at what time? On the 18th, Abigail knows that he's dead, and she confirms it on the 20th when she resumes that letter. Palmer on the 19th seems to know it, and yet, on the other hand, on the 21st or something, the provincial Congress is electing James Warren in place of Palmer, Warren, James Warren in place of Joseph Warren, who is supposedly dead. So there's this whole question, the body is left, it's unidentified for a while, it appears to be worked over. He was not the only one. I think they were angry, I think, the British, and I think there was a fair amount of over enthusiasm on a number of the fallen. But yeah, I mean, the body is apparently stripped, so there's no identification. His brother finally has to come and identify him like 2 or 3 days later, which is the final confirmation. Yeah, have I got this? Wait, is that, yeah. I don't know about that. Joe?
Precursor to that, in May, there was the Battle of Chelsea Creek.
Yes.
When the British tried to get out to go north, and they were stopped. I was wondering if that had any repercussions to the British saying, okay, we're gonna stay and fight it out.
Well, these various tests, right? So to some degree, Grape Island isn't a test at that point. They've assumed that they can just go down there, grab what they need, and leave again, and they're not going to encounter any significant resistance. Chelsea Creek is another one of those tests, as in how far are we going to be able to go. There's also an escalating level of desperation that's related to resources, that's related to food, that's related to feeding all of the livestock that they have
They were
within
trying to
Boston.
pull that stuff out.
Yep, and so those kinds of interactions and the failures of places like Chelsea Creek are going to be a part of that larger contribution to the British strategic understanding of Boston as not something that's going to be fruitful for them over time. But these small skirmishes are very important for doing that, which is why I mentioned.
First naval encounter.
Yes, yes, and they would lose it. They would lose a ship in that encounter. So.
And one foot.
So these are important but small elements psychologically on both sides that help to bolster people who are not used to being involved in warfare and give other messages to those who are.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. Well, with that in mind, thank you for everyone.